before we set sail, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far across the seas our crew has gathered. Now, breathe easy, settle in, and let's drift back to the golden age of piracy. If you imagine the golden age of piracy as a single bright flare on the timeline of ocean history, it glows most intensely from the late 1600s into the 1720s. Sailors and scholars often narrow the brilliant centre to about 1716 through 1726, but the fuse was lit much earlier, and the smoke trails on for decades after. To understand what it was like to be alive then, drifting between law and opportunity, you have to feel the forces that pushed ordinary seamen toward the black flag. Those forces were not mysterious. They were the winds of trade, the rhythms of war and peace, and the rough arithmetic of hunger, wages and risk. The Atlantic world swelled with ships after 1650. European empires were busy carving plantations into tropical soil and drawing silver, sugar, tobacco, cocoa, indigo, coffee and logwood into their ports. Each product had its own season, its own scent, and its own pathway across the water. Spanish treasure, in heavy chests, moved along the Spanish Main from the mines of the Americas to staging points like Portobello and Cartagena, then to Havana to join the annual flotta that sprinted for Cadiz when the hurricane slept. English, Dutch and French merchants hauled barrels, bales and casks between Europe, Africa and the Americas, turning the ocean into a set of habits: predictable routes, predictable winds, predictable profits. Predictability is good for business. It is also good for thieves. War sharpened this predictability and then just as suddenly dumped thousands of trained men back on shore. Europe fought almost continuously. The Anglo-Dutch Wars in the mid-1600s, the 9 Years' War in the 1690s, and the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714. In wartime, governments handed out letters of marque that turned private ships into legal predators. Crews learned to chase, board and divide prize money under a set of rules everyone understood. The work was dangerous, but it was paid, and it felt legitimate. Then peace would arrive with the sweep of a quill. Letters of marque expired. Captains who had been respectable hunters on Friday awoke on Monday to find themselves unwanted, unpaid, and in debt to chandlers for rope and tar. The ocean hadn't changed. The trade winds hadn't changed, and the merchantmen were still out there, fat with cargo and often thinly defended. What changed was the paperwork. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession is a vivid example. In 1713 and 1714, treaties signed in European palaces ended a long struggle, fought in Atlantic swells and Caribbean heat. Thousands of privateers and naval hands were suddenly adrift in places like Jamaica, Barbados and the Carolinas. Harbourfront taverns filled with men skilled in gunnery, sail handling and close quarters fighting, men who measured their worth in the number of prizes they had helped take. Peace did not offer them much. Merchant wages were low and uncertain, captains were often brutal, and the Royal Navy still sent press gangs to recruit by force. For many, the choice felt simple: accept a hungry, rigid life under the lash, or reinvent yourself outside the law with shipmates you trusted, under a code you could vote on. Geography helped make that reinvention possible. The Caribbean is a maze of channels and banks, guarded by coral and shoals. The Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the Mona Passage off Puerto Rico, the Yucatan Channel, the Straits of Florida, the Bahama Banks, and the protected coves of the Lesser Antilles, each offered shortcuts and hideaways. Faster, shallower drafted craft could dart where heavy naval frigates laboured. The trade winds and currents were steady. A skilled navigator could time a chase or a getaway like a tide clock. On sand-fringed islands, a crew could careen a ship, heel it over to scrape barnacles, patch seams and coat the hull, then slip back into the blue before a governor's warrant crossed his desk. Commerce added a crucial detail. Much of what crossed these seas was compact and sellable. Sugar could be rebarreled. Indigo cakes and dye wood could be stacked like firewood. Tobacco, cocoa, and coffee travelled in tidy parcels. And coins, especially Spanish silver dollars, the famous pieces of 8, were accepted everywhere and easy to divide. A single seized merchantman could turn a months of uncertainty into cash in hand by the following week, especially if a friendly tavern keeper, storehouse owner, or ship chandler stood ready to buy, no questions asked. Networks of fences and fixers grew wherever law was thin and money was quick. The shadow economy needed product. The pirates supplied it. You can trace earlier phases of this story before the famous names arrive. In the mid to late 1600s, the so-called buccaneering era flourished out of places like Tortuga and Port Royal. European powers tolerated, even encouraged attacks on Spanish shipping and settlements when it suited them. Captains oscillated between privateering and something that looked a lot like piracy, depending on who held the paperwork that month. In 1692, an earthquake shattered Port Royal, swallowing whole streets and reminding everyone how precarious those havens could be. But the habits and skills did not vanish. They moved, as maritime cultures do, to the next safe anchorage. By the 1690s, opportunity widened into the Indian Ocean. Ships out of Europe rounded the Cape, then lurked near the Red Sea and the Indian coast, where Mughal and other Asian merchants carried high-value goods. Names like Henry Avery and Thomas Tew flicker here, not as larger-than-life heroes, but as examples of how global trade made global piracy possible. A successful strike against an Indian treasure ship could ripple back to London, Amsterdam and Surat, generating both outrage and envy. Outrage hardened laws, envy lured imitators. As before, the end of each war sent trained crews looking for the same familiar work without the legal gloss. Then came the spike. After 1713, the Caribbean and the North American coast filled with experienced mariners and slim pickings. The same peace that shut down privateering did not suddenly improve wages or soften the discipline aboard merchant ships. Sailors still faced floggings for small offences, short rations, and long months without pay. Impressment, being seized for naval service, remained a constant fear in port. In that climate, the promise of a written shipboard agreement felt revolutionary. Pirate articles, crew-made rules, spelled out equal votes, clear shares, and compensation for injury. They were not utopian documents. Punishment could be severe, and the work remained deadly. But compared to the arbitrary power many had known, these rules felt like a kind of rough justice. This wasn't just theft. It was an attempt to recast the terms of life at sea. Specific events accelerated the transformation. In 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet wrecked along the Florida coast during hurricane season. Salvage operations began immediately, watched closely by desperate sailors, wreckers, and adventurers looking for a way in. The Bahamas, with their shallow banks and countless cays, became a staging ground for those who preferred to salvage by force. Nassau turned into a magnet, part marketplace, part rumour mill, part repair yard, where crews shared intelligence about convoys, patrols and soft targets. For a brief few years, it felt to many like a place where the usual rules did not apply. Behind the scenery ran the slow machinery of empire. Laws were tightened. In London and colonial capitals, officials set up vice-admiralty courts to speed trials and bypass sympathetic juries. Governors wrote home for more ships, more men, more money. Royal proclamations offered pardons to any pirate who surrendered by a deadline, hoping to split crews into the resigned and the defiant. Some accepted, took the king's mercy, and tried to go straight. Others laughed, tore the notices down, and sailed for another season, gambling that the ocean was still bigger than the law. Economics kept underwriting those gambles. Plantation colonies needed constant resupply. Ships kept sailing even when the risk of attack rose. Many merchant captains sailed with minimal crews to save on wages, which made resistance harder and boarding easier. Convoys were irregular and sometimes slow. Insurance markets adapted. raising premiums but not high enough to stop the flow of goods. As long as valuable cargo moved along predictable routes, a clever, fast-sailing predator could take a share. When you imagine standing on a deck in those years, say 1718, what you're feeling is not just danger and rebellion. You're feeling the imbalance between what the sea demanded and what the official world offered in return. The sea demanded skill, knowledge of winds and currents, the ability to reef canvas in a squall, the nerve to run a reef-studded channel by starlight. It demanded bodies that could heave at the capstan, keep time at the pumps, and swing aboard another vessel in a blur of rope and wood. In return, the lawful path often offered late pay and a lash. The unlawful path offered uncertainty too, but with immediate reward and a voice in how the risk was taken. In that narrow margin, thousands made their choice. It is important to see how short-lived the brightest part of the age was. The same factors that fed it, the glut of skilled men, the gaps in enforcement, the steady stream of rich cargo, could not hold forever. Naval tactics improved. Faster sloops of war were dispatched specifically to hunt. Governors who had looked the other way were replaced by those who did not. But in the years before that clampdown took full effect, the ocean felt different to the men who worked it. Harbours that had been sleepy became loud with music and coin. Remote beaches turned into shipyards. Tavern tables were covered with crude charts, rumours, and coins from a dozen mints. A young sailor could listen to the talk, sign a paper promising shares and votes, and step across a gangplank into a new identity. All of this, war and peace, law and loophole, geography and cargo, made the Golden Age feel inevitable while it lasted. It was never just about fearsome flags or famous names. It was about timing. Peace after long wars poured trained, hungry men into exactly the right waters, at exactly the moment when ocean trade was wealthiest and most regular, and before empires had fully built the legal and naval scaffolding to protect it. That alignment did not last. But for a brief span, the lanes of the Atlantic and beyond were crowded with small, fast silhouettes, angling across the wind. Crews who believed for a season that they could rewrite the terms of life at sea. If you stepped aboard a pirate ship in the early 1700s and looked around, you would not see a single type of person repeating from bow to stern. You would see a gathering of the Atlantic world itself, faces weathered by sun and salt, accents from London alleys and Breton coves, from Yoruba villages and the Mosquito Coast, from Cork and Cadiz and the Cape Verde Islands. Some had learned to splice rope as boys on cold North Sea coasters. Others were canoemen and pilots from West Africa, fluent in currents and bars that European captains feared. Many had served the crowns of Europe yesterday as privateers, and found themselves unwanted today. Their letters of marque turned to scrap by peace treaties. A few were carpenters and coopers who had been told on shore that their bills would never be paid. Some came willingly, some came wary and were won over. A smaller number were taken as prisoners and chose the black flag rather than a hard return to the lash. The ages mixed more than people imagine. There were quick-handed boys of 14 who had lied about their years to ship out, and there were old hands in their 40s whose backs knew the rhythm of the capstan without looking. Many were in their 20s, bodies strong and teeth already failing, knuckles scarred from blocks and belaying pins. A surprising number carried the marks of earlier seas, ears pierced to ward off ill luck, tattoos made with soot and needle, and sometimes a missing finger, an eye clouded, or a leg replaced with a wooden peg cut by the ship's carpenter. Disability did not necessarily end a sailor's usefulness. The code of shares often promised compensation for lost limbs, and a man who could still aim a swivel gun or keep the sandglass might be worth his ration. Nationalities meant less on deck than skill. English, Irish, Scots and Welsh were common simply because English shipping was everywhere, but Dutch gunners, French helmsmen, Spanish-speaking pilots, Portuguese and Luso-African sailors, and men from Scandinavia, Germany and the Italian ports turned up in the muster as well. African and Afro-Caribbean mariners were more than a handful of exceptional cases. They were a steady presence, some freed from captured slave ships, some who had long worked the water as fishermen, boatmen and pilots. In certain crews along the Spanish Main or the Guinea coast, they could make up a large share of the hands. On the western rim of the Caribbean, mosquito hunters from the Mosquito Coast, famously sharp with musket and at home in dugout canoes, joined buccaneers and later pirates as scouts, turtliers and guides through intricate lagoons. Indigenous and African navigational knowledge, where the shoals caught the keel, where fresh water seeped in mangrove roots, where a current turned under a certain headland, often decided whether a chase succeeded or a ship lay aground for the hangman's noose to find. The reasons people went on the account, as pirates said, were as tangled as the rigging. Low or unpaid wages rank first. A merchant sailor might wait months for pay, only to find deductions for clothing, tobacco and tools purchased at inflated prices from the ship's own stores. Discipline was harsh and could be arbitrary. A surly word might earn the cat, a small theft might bring irons. Neglect of duty could bring a court-martial if the Navy pressed you into service. Impressment itself, being seized by a press gang and forced into the Navy, made ports feel dangerous to free men. By contrast, pirate articles promised something that felt radical at sea. Defined shares instead of uncertain wages, a vote in choosing the captain and quartermaster, a say in when to fight and when to flee, and clear rules for dividing plunder and compensating the wounded. It was not an equal world in the modern sense, but compared to a merchantman's tyranny, it looked like a rough negotiation between men who did the same labour and took the same shot. The shipboard society these people built leaned on function. A good boatswain was gold. The man who kept rigging sound, who could rig a jury mast under fire, who knew when a line would part before it did. The carpenter mattered as much as any gunner. He could stop a leak, scarf a new section into a sprung spar, and fit a false keel for a long run across shallow banks. A gunner who could lay a piece true enough to knock out a rudder with one raking shot saved blood and time. A surgeon, often more barber than physician, might be taken from a captured ship and offered a share to stay. A fiddler or fifer could find steady work as well. Music lifted hands on the braces and soothed nerves at night. The quartermaster, elected by the crew, carried real weight. He represented the hands, guarded the common chest, divided victuals and plunder, settled disputes, and could check a captain who confused courage with recklessness. Women were rare on the water for practical and cultural reasons. Cramped space, superstition, and the constant risk of scandal in a floating village, but not absent. The best known, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, wore men's clothes, fought in boarding parties, and earned full shares. They were not the only women who moved through pirate worlds. In port they owned taverns, bought and resold stolen goods, ran lodging houses that were half intelligence bureaus and half brokers' offices, and offered credit when a crew's coin threatened to run out. Some became companions and informants, some arranged repairs, forged papers, and made sure that when a crew sailed at dawn, a barrel of beef and a keg of powder stood ready under canvas. Not everyone who stood under the black flag began as a free volunteer. Captured sailors were sometimes pressed to fill out crews after battle losses. Pirate captains distinguished between forced men and those who signed articles freely. Courts later listened for that distinction when hangings were on offer. Many pressed men, given time under the code and a taste of equal shares, chose to stay. A smaller number chose escape at the first friendly port, slipping off into the alleys to find passage home, or perhaps to try their luck under another captain rumoured to be fairer or richer. Religion trailed aboard as lightly as a pennant. Oaths were sworn, sometimes on a Bible, sometimes on crossed pistols, sometimes on a hatchet resting on the chest. Crews could be a jumble of Protestants and Catholics, and men who cared little for doctrine but much for wind and water. A parson, if present among prisoners, might be treated with courtesy or with jokes depending on the captain's mood. Sundays could be quieter if the weather and the chase allowed, with hammocks aired and clothes washed. But if a topsail showed on the horizon, the Sabbath turned into any other day. Race and freedom sat together uneasily in this floating society. Pirates freed enslaved people from prizes often enough that the news travelled, and many black sailors found a kind of mobility and voice within crews that would have been closed to them ashore. At the same time, some pirates sold captured human beings back into bondage when money beckoned and the moment favoured cruelty over principle. The same ship could carry a quartermaster who insisted on equal fights and pay for all hands, and a captain who dealt in human cargo on the next tide. The ocean gave room for contradictions. The code gave only partial shelter from them. Clothing was whatever lasted and moved well. Calico shirts, striped sashes to hold pistols, loose trousers, bare feet for grip, broad hats against glare, and sometimes gaudy bits, silk scarves, a bright waistcoat taken from a prize, a string of beads, because a man might enjoy colour after months of tar and salt. The famed pirate look was less costume than adaptation. Fabrics that dried quickly, belts that could carry tools and weapons, and layers a man could shed in heat or seize in a squall. The Jolly Roger, when raised, did the work of a gale. If a crew's reputation said they rarely showed mercy after resistance, then surrender came quickly and blood was spared. That reputation rested on who the crew was, and crews changed as voyages unfolded. Hands left in port with their shares. New volunteers came aboard. A carpenter traded in, a surgeon remained, a fiddler died of fever, and his instrument went to the common chest. Language aboard blended like the crew. Orders were crisp English or French or Dutch, depending on the deck, but the talk below swirled with sailors' cant and loanwords, capstan and caboose, hammocks and hardtack, doubloons and pieces of eight, cigars from Spanish shores, Matalock camaraderie from French messes. A man might curse in 3 tongues and pray in a 4th. What mattered was that he understood hands to braces at night and silence when the quartermaster called the roll for shares. Portside life fed the mix. In Nassau, New Providence, or the smaller Bahama Cays, in the Carolina Outer Banks or on Jamaica's North Shore, in coves of Hispaniola and along the logwood camps of Campeche Bay, men met and swapped crews like cards. A sailor robbed by a merchant captain in Barbados might take passage to New Providence and listen to the talk in a tavern's back room. By sunrise he had signed articles and tumbled his hammock aboard a sloop whose hull still smelled of pitch. On the far side of Africa, Madagascar's outports gathered a different crowd. Men who had hunted in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, who knew the monsoon like a calendar, who spoke a little Arabic and a little Malagasy, who could tell you which pilot to trust into a coral lagoon. The ocean was wide, but the gossip was quick. Names of captains ran ahead of their ships, along with their reputations for fairness, courage, or greed. Even among men who shared danger and plunder, personality coloured everything. Some captains were charismatic and cautious, spending lives like coins, only when the return promised more lives saved later. Others burned fast, daring to the edge of foolishness. Crews responded. A captain who ignored counsel could be voted out and a new leader chosen, a rare thing in the age's rigid hierarchies. The quartermaster's voice carried the weight of the deck. If he said a man deserved another chance, or that a thief should be marooned with a musket and a flask of powder, the decision usually held. Shipboard justice was immediate and practical. Theft from a shipmate, striking a superior outside of battle, desertion in the face of the enemy. These could bring lashes, loss of shares, or the shore. The rules protected the fragile trust that let men sleep while others stood watch. What drew such a range of people together was less romance than arithmetic. If you were a gunner with a steady eye, or a pilot who knew a dangerous inlet by smell, or a carpenter whose adze could make a sprung leak drinkless, your value increased where decisions were made by men who worked beside you. A whole share in a rich prize could equal years of uncertain wages. A man maimed might still be fed and clothed by the common chest. A voice in council might be the difference between a captain's boldness and a captain's vanity. The faces on deck were not all alike, and their reasons for being there were not the same. But when the glass ran out and the watch changed, when a lookout's cry floated down from the foretop, and the sails were trimmed without a wasted word, the ship moved like a single mind carried by many hands. If you picture the ships that made piracy possible at its height, set aside the towering galleons of old paintings, and think, instead of lean, purposeful craft that moved like knives through cloth. The favoured hull was small to middling in size, often a sloop or brigantine, shallow in draught and quick to answer the helm. A sloop with its fore and aft sails could point closer to the wind than the big square riggers it hunted. It tacked nimbly through narrow cuts, and could slip over shoals that would leave a frigate grinding its keel. A brigantine, square-rigged on the foremast and fore and aft on the main, blended downwind speed with enough agility to work to windward when needed. Early schooners, just coming into wider use along the North American coast, sometimes found their way under the black flag too, long, low and lively in light airs, ideal for coasts riddled with inlets. None of these ships looked like floating fortresses. They looked like opportunists. Speed and handling were the true armament. A pirate sloop might displace under 100 tons or a bit over, carry 60 to 120 men, and mount perhaps 8 to 14 small carriage guns along her sides. 4 to 6 pounders were common, augmented by a sprinkling of swivels perched on the rail. Those swivels, spitting a scatter of musket balls or scrap iron, were brutal at close range when a boarding party swarmed over. A couple of long chase guns were rigged forward or aft for the moments that mattered most. A clean shot into a merchantman's rudder to end a pursuit, or a spiteful snap back at a pursuer's rigging to buy a little time. But even the guns were secondary to the hull and canvas. Pirates wanted to get alongside fast, terrify, and end the business before cargo or crew were ruined. The rig was everything. Fore and aft sails, gaff mains, staysails, jibs could be trimmed fine for beating up narrow channels against a trade wind. Square topsails, if carried, added drive off the wind without turning the ship into a clumsy tub. Running rigging, sheets, halyards, braces, snaked through blocks worn smooth by hands and salt. Standing rigging was heavy tarred hemp, black to the eye and sticky to the touch. Men went aloft barefoot to feel the rope better, toes finding purchase on ratlines as naturally as breathing. Reef points stitched along the sails let a crew shorten canvas in squalls quickly. A good sailmaker's hand, flat seams, neat patches, meant the difference between a controlled squall and a shredded night. Every man learned the language of the wind through his fingers, the minute twang of a sheet when a gust hit, the soft luff at the luff when a sail asked for a handspan of sheet, the way the helm grew light when the balance was right. Below the waterline the story was maintenance. Warm seas fouled hulls fast, barnacles, weed, and the wood-eating worm gnawed speed away and strength with it. So pirates careened, a word that smells of hot tar and smoke. They chose a secluded beach behind a reef or deep in a mangrove creek, set anchors off the beam, and hauled the ship down on her side with tackles until the belly of the hull showed. Cargo, guns, even the mainmast might come out to lighten the lift. Then came days of scraping with irons, driving new oakum into seams with mallets and caulking irons, and paying the planks with a mix of tar, pitch, tallow and resin that gleamed in the sun. The longboat ferried casks of water and wood. Men stood watch with muskets at the edge of the trees, because careening made a ship strong, but left her naked if a patrol found the creek. When the hull was tight and slick again, they hauled her upright, stepped the mast bent on freshened sails, and the ship felt young. Inside, space was a negotiation. The hold carried water in great casks stowed low for ballast, salted meat and biscuit, spare rigging and sails, a carpenter's chest with saws and adzes, and the common chest with tools and the small valuables that would be parcelled later. Powder was kept dry and separate in the magazine. No open flame near it. Lanthorns were hooded and careful, because fire at sea turns quick from friend to murderer. Between decks, hammocks hung in rows, clued up every morning to clear space for the day's running life. Headroom was stingy. A tall man learned to duck beams instinctively. The cook worked at a brick or iron caboose, slinging pots that never truly cooled. The surgeon, if there was one and if he stayed, kept his instruments, saws, forceps, needles, wrapped oiled against the salt air, and silently wished for lemon or limes he could never get enough of. Weapons lay where a deckhand could find them at a shout. Racks of muskets and pistols were kept clean and dry. Powder horns were corked tight. Cutlasses hung ready at the mainmast. Grapnels coiled on deck like sleeping iron spiders, waiting to fly and bite a victim's rail. Sand lay in boxes near the guns to give footing when blood and seawater slicked the planks. Nets could be rigged above the waist to check boarders coming the other way. A cautious crew set them before a tricky approach, then cut them free when the chase surrendered and speed mattered more than safety. Navigation was craft and habit. No chronometers ticked yet in a velvet box. Longitude was dead reckoning refined by the lead and the log. The helmsman watched the compass card bobbing under its smoky glass, listening for the master's numbers. So many points free, meet her, steady. A chip log, a simple wooden quadrant on a measured line, went over the stern. The sandglass turned. The count sang out. The speed in knots was marked and noted on the traverse board. Latitude was the sky's gift. The backstaff or cross-staff lifted to the noon sun. A scribbled line in the log, and a line on a chart brought the world into something like order. A leadsman forward called depth in a chant of fathoms, sometimes with tallow pressed into the hollow of the lead to bring up a smear of the bottom, shell, sand, ooze, that told an old pilot exactly which bay's mouth he was feeling in the dark. Because these ships were tools first, pirates altered them as soon as they took them. A captured merchantman had too few hands and too much top hamper for quick work. Down came excess cabins and rail, less windage, more fighting space. Gun ports were cut where needed. Spare spars were lashed ready to step as jury masts. A longboat was hoisted to davits for speed in launching. Sometimes ballast was shifted forward to give a longer, cleaner run when chasing. Sometimes guns were thrown overboard during a desperate flight to lighten the ship and raise another half knot from the hull. Sails were swapped for better cuts. A lucky crew might seize a bolt of fine canvas and turn it into a mainsail that drew like a new lung. The boatwork around the mothership mattered more than outsiders imagine. A yawl or pinnace could creep into a creek at dusk to scout a hiding place, or to parley with a fence ashore. A longboat under muffled oars could tow the sloop when the sea went glassy, or serve as a platform for boarding when a cautious merchant captain tried to fend off with yards and booms. In a calm, crews set sweeps, long oars, out through the gun ports and heaved like galley men for a mile to gain a breath of wind at the edge of a bay. Kedging, rowing an anchor ahead in the boat, dropping it, then warping the ship up to it, moved a hull against contrary wind just enough to change fortune in a narrow channel. On deck, the choreography of a chase looked effortless when done well. The lookout's hail from the foretop brought men to their stations. The helm went over, braces snapped taut, the head sails drew and the ship leaned sweetly into her run. A false flag might rise under the lee of a topsail, the real colours coiled and waiting. As distance closed, the crew read the other ship's life in little signs, the set of her canvas, the sloppiness of her trim, the nervousness of men running without order. If the prey tried to flee, the bow chasers thumped. If she tried to fight, the captain edged for the stern to rake, to smash steering and shatter nerve. At the last, grapnels flew and bit home, swivels cracked, muskets spoke from the tops, and a storm of shouts and splinters ended with the crash of two hulls leaning together like wrestlers. The entire scene might last minutes. Ammunition, men, and time were never to be wasted. Not every pirate sailed small. A few, for a daring season, took and armed larger ships. stout former slavers built for speed, or captured warships with real teeth. Those were floating declarations of intent, impressive and terrifying, but they burned too bright. Too many guns to feed, too deep a draft to hide in the creeks that kept lesser hunters safe, too obvious to slip through a busy roadstead unnoticed. The smaller predators survived longer because they could become water again. Black Hull turned to shadow under a squall line, mastheads vanishing behind a low sand spit where no one expected a deep-keel ship to dare. Every part of the vessel taught economy. The carpenter saved every useful offcut and bolt he could pry from a prize. Iron was dear, oakum precious, tar a comfort. The sailmaker unpicked good thread from rotten cloth to reuse. The boatswain's locker held coils of marline, spare blocks and palm and needle. Men tarred the standing rigging often, hands and clothes stained until the smell followed them ashore. They scrubbed decks with sand and stone until the planks shone. They pumped the bilge by hourglass, listening to the wet cough of the valves as a reassuring metronome against rot and doom. Anchors were the teeth that let a light ship bite the world. 2-bower anchors hung ready at the bow, with cables bent and carefully flaked, the bitter ends made fast. A kedge was kept where it could be manhandled into a boat on a minute's notice. In sudden squalls, anchors saved lives. In sudden opportunities, a fat Indiaman rumoured to be watering inside a bar. They gave the grip needed to pounce and then leap away again before a fort woke up. At night, the ship folded into itself. Sails were snug to the night's weather. The helm's lantern threw a soft halo. The compass card floated steady as a heartbeat. The watch paced and listened, to the wind in the rigging, to the gentle creak of timbers working, to the soft hiss of the bow wave when there was one. Somewhere in the dark the lead plashed and the chant came back, "By the mark, 5." And the master, half asleep on a rolled cloak, knew by feel whether the bottom was right. A good hull and a careful crew made even the blackest night something like safe. What kept these ships dangerous was not mystery but matching design to purpose. A hull shallow enough to live among banks and islands, a rig that could claw off a lee shore and still sprint with the trades, just enough iron to frighten and disable, just enough men to flood a deck at the moment of decision, and the constant stubborn work of keeping wood, rope and canvas sound in a world always trying to rot and tear them apart. They were not great ships, they were clever ones, and in clever hands in the years when patrols were too few and cargoes too rich, that was enough. Before a voyage truly began, long before the first distant sail was chased or the first shot was fired, a different kind of work unfolded on deck, the making of a contract among outlaws. Men gathered in the open air with the sea hissing along the hull, and someone produced a set of articles, rules written in a blunt hand on rough paper or parchment, sometimes stitched into a little book. These weren't grand charters full of elegant language. They were practical promises about money, risk and behaviour in a world where mistakes cost blood. Each man had to agree one by one. Sometimes the oath was sworn over a Bible, sometimes over crossed pistols or a cutlass, sometimes simply with a spit in the palm and a handshake, because what mattered most was that everyone on board would live, and possibly die, by the same lines of ink. The most radical line in a time of rigid hierarchies was simple: a vote. Crews elected the captain and the quartermaster, and they could turn them out if trust evaporated. This wasn't a gentle process. A captain who squandered lives, bullied the crew without cause, hoarded luxuries, or botched a chase could find himself stripped of command between sunrise and noon. His chest opened, his fine coat handed to a man who had earned more respect. Yet the code also acknowledged reality. In battle, the captain's word ran like iron. When the enemy's stern loomed and the grapnels flew, the crew wanted a single mind, decisive and unhesitating. The rough democracy bent to necessity. Debate ceased, orders snapped, and afterward, only afterward, the arguments resumed if they needed to. Between fights, the quartermaster's shadow lay long. Elected like the captain but answerable directly to the crew, he guarded the common chest, oversaw rations, distributed clothing and powder, kept a ledger of debts and advances, and crucially had a say in discipline. On many decks, if you felt wronged by the captain, you went to the quartermaster first. He could call a council, hear witnesses, and recommend punishment or mercy. He also led boarding parties as often as the captain did. Courage alone did not distinguish the roles. Authority was divided on purpose so no single temper could ruin the ship. Money, being the sharpest edge aboard, received the most careful attention. The code replaced wages with shares. A captain might receive 2 full shares of any prize, the quartermaster a share and a half. Specialists, gunner, boatswain, carpenter, sailmaker, surgeon, an extra half share or more. Ordinary hands a single share, boys and new learners less. Those numbers moved from ship to ship, but the principle held: clear, predictable, written. No waiting for a distant owner to release wages in arrears. No hidden deductions for clothing and tobacco bought at inflated prices from the ship's own store. If the crew risked their necks together, they divided the result together. There was insurance too, crude but real, because the ocean chews men. Articles often spelled out compensation for wounds, the loss of a right arm worth more than a left, a leg worth more than a finger, the loss of an eye or a shattered jaw valued in coin, and sometimes in extra future shares. No one believed money repaired a body, but it bought restland, care, and a chance to live without starving. In an age before formal workers' protection, this was a homemade safety net lashed together out of necessity and experience. Every man watching a boarding ladder shake under his boots knew what those lines meant. Discipline clauses did not try to make saints, they tried to keep a floating village livable. Theft from a shipmate or the common stock was treated more harshly than theft from a captured enemy, because it attacked the trust that let men sleep on watch. The first offence might bring the loss of shares or a flogging, the second marooning on a barren quay with a musket, powder, water, and a hope. Quarrels were to be cooled before they exploded. Many codes forbade fighting on board and required that grudges be settled ashore, pistols or cutlasses in hand, with a referee to stop the affair at first blood. Gambling with dice and cards was often banned or tightly limited, not out of piety, but because debt sparked theft and theft sparked knives. The details of daily life turned into rules in a way that feels almost tender across the centuries. Candles after a certain hour, only with permission to prevent fire. Musicians on board, they were obliged to play when spirits needed lifting, but they also had a guaranteed day of rest each week when the weather allowed. Smoking? Allowed, but away from powder and only with a covered lanthorn because flame is a treacherous friend. Weapons? Keep your pistols, cutlass and flints clean and ready. Fines or loss of shares fell on the man who let rust steal a shipmate's life. Clothes? Take what you like from prizes within reason, but don't strip a prisoner naked to his humiliation. And when the code said no rummaging a seaman's chest, it meant privacy had a place even here. Because the code was a contract, it had to be seen. Some captains nailed it up in the great cabin, others kept it in the quartermaster's chests and read it aloud to new hands. Courts later used these papers against captured crews. The very clarity that made shipboard life fairer made prosecution easier. In dockside trials, prosecutors would hold up a set of articles as proof that the accused had not merely drifted into crime, but had pledged participation in an organised venture. Pirates understood that risk. They kept signing anyway, because life without rules was worse. Joining the company usually followed a ritual. New men, whether volunteers found in a friendly tavern or prisoners who had agreed to stay, were told the ship's name, introduced to the officers, and offered a look at the articles. They could ask questions about shares and duties. They might even propose a small amendment if the crew respected their skills. Then came the oath and the mark. Some could write their names, many scratched an X, and the quartermaster assigned a watch, a hammock, a place in the mess, and often an advance in clothing, tobacco, or tools to be deducted from the first prize. From that moment, the newcomer fell under the same shelter and the same storm as everyone else. Punishments were swift, not because men were crueler than their time, but because ships are small worlds where grudges rot the beams. The lash was used, but not with the ritual theatre of the navy. Ears might be slit to mark a thief, a nose might be flattened, a head shaved clean to signal disgrace in the next port. Marooning, much feared, was not the cartoon of abandoning a man on a sandbar for sport. It was the deliberate unmaking of membership. A musket, a few charges, water, and a knife gave a sliver of hope and salved the crew's conscience. But everyone knew the sentence could be slow death. That severity guarded the code the way oakum guards a seam. The rough democracy could be tender when it needed to be. A man fevered or wounded might find his messmates excused from duty to nurse him, and the quartermaster could authorize extra rations or a dram of rum for the sick. If a sailor lost his chest in a fire or his clothes overboard in a squall, the common stock clothed him again. If the surgeon asked for quiet after a brutal hour with saw and needle, the deck fell to whispers without being told. When a man died, even on a ship outside the law, the articles often prescribed a decent sea burial and a fair settlement of his shares to the friend he named or the woman he called his wife, whether the church recognized her or not. All this fairness had a practical edge. It made the ship dangerous. Men who felt their voice counted fought with more confidence. Men who trusted that plunder would be divided honestly boarded faster and with less hesitation. Men who believed a wound would not abandon them took risks that turned the balance of a fight. A captain who knew he could be voted out for pointless cruelty moderated his temper or lost his post. A quartermaster who slacked his duty found himself replaced by evening. The code was not a sermon. It was an engine that converted trust into speed. There were, of course, contradictions. Some ships preached equality and then favoured old friends with first pick of luxuries. Some captains decorated their cabins with fine linen and china, while insisting that 2 shares did not mean extra delicacies. Some crews proclaimed that race did not matter at sea, and then sold captured people ashore when the price glittered. Others made a point of enrolling black and indigenous sailors as full hands with full shares and defended them fiercely. The code could not heal the moral fractures of its age, but it offered, at its best, lines of defence against the worst of them. In ports that became pirate havens, the logic of the articles bled ashore. Tavern keepers extended credit to crews not because they trusted individuals, but because they trusted the quartermaster's ledger. Chandlers sold powder and biscuit because they knew the common chest would settle with hard coin after the next cruise. Carpenters bargained for labour and paid wages in kind because the code's clarity had made planning possible. The same rules that turned a ship into a functioning micro-society turned a ramshackle harbour into an economy where reputation and enforcement, by word and by the occasional fist, replaced courts and contracts. Even the symbols tied back to governance. The black flag, with skulls or hourglasses or bleeding hearts, was more than theatre. It was a tool to reduce conflict. A ship known for keeping its word, that those who surrendered quickly would not be slaughtered, could often take prizes without a fight, preserving cargo and crew lives alike. If a captain violated that pledge, word would spread in taverns and forecastles, and the next merchantman would fight to the last, costing blood and time. The crew had a say in that reputation because they paid for it in scars. Many articles specified how prisoners would be treated, who could be ransomed, and who must be set ashore intact. When a cruise ran long, the code's texture thickened. The quartermaster balanced dwindling water against the promise of one more chase. The carpenter argued for time to make the pumps safe. The gunner demanded powder kept dry even if it meant fewer candles for comfort. Votes decided whether to stand off a dangerous harbour mouth for a rumoured fat India man or to bear away for a safer anchorage to careen. No one pretended the vote made outcomes certain, but it spread ownership of the risk. If the decision ended badly, it was everyone's burden, not a single man's whim. The most striking thing looking back across the spray and smoke is how ordinary the code made the extraordinary feel. A crew outside all imperial law built, with their own hands and words, a serviceable replacement, a blend of contract and custom, insurance and mutual aid, punishment and mercy. It functioned because it matched the grain of their lives. Sailors who had been cheated by distant owners insisted on transparent accounts. Men who had swallowed the lash for petty slights insisted that power be split and supervised. Fighters who knew how fast fortune turned insisted that wounds be treated as a common debt. They were not philosophers writing treatises, they were practitioners writing procedures, and yet, in that practicality something quietly subversive stirred. At a time when most workers on land and sea had no say over their labour, here were hundreds of floating assemblies where votes decided leaders, rules were read aloud, and the treasury was accounted for line by line. It could be ugly, it could be unjust, it could fail. But in the space between a captain's order and a quartermaster's ledger, in the ink that promised a man 3/8 of a share for a shattered arm, in the silence after a quarrel deferred until the next safe shore, there lived a rough, working democracy, made by necessity, enforced by peers, and carried across the water by men who had learned the hard way, that fairness, like a well-cut sail, is not an ornament, but a piece of equipment. Morning begins before the sun, when the horizon is a charcoal line, and the sea breathes like something asleep. A sleepy boy turns the sand glass. The last few grains whisper down, and the ship's bell answers with soft iron notes, one stroke for each half-hour past. The watch on deck has ribs of dew, and the men move in a quiet rhythm learned by their hands. Someone coils a sheet that has crept into a snarl. Another checks a seizing on a shroud. A third leans on the rail and reads the wind on the water, a darker cat's paw crossing toward them. The helmsman's fingers rest lightly on the tiller or wheel. The compass card floats in its little universe, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere forward, the leadsman sings out a depth and draws up the lead with a smear of pale sand clinging to the tallow. Good bottom for this stretch. At dawn proper the world turns blue and then bright. Hammocks are loosed from their clews and rolled into neat sausages, lashed and stowed to clear the deck. A man who ties a clumsy bundle hears about it. Space is everything and order is safety. Clothes and bedding are aired along the weather rail to chase mildew. The cook, who slept near his galley like a dragon with one eye open, has coaxed the coals back to life. The first pot is always water, for oatmeal when there is any, for peas to soften, for a precious brew of chocolate or coffee if the last prize surrendered a crate and the quartermaster chose generosity. Most mornings it is simpler fare. Ship's biscuit hard enough to need a tap from the back of a knife to shake out any weevils, a slice of salted pork or beef if the casks are holding, a slosh of watered wine, small beer or rum. Fresh food comes in bright bursts, a sea turtle turned on its back on some quiet quay and butchered into steaks, flying fish netted by lantern light, plantains, limes, onions or cassava taken at a friendly beach or from a prize's storeroom. Those days taste like a holiday. The watches keep the ship's pulse. 4 hours on, 4 off, all day and all night, with the 2 dog watches at day's end split into 2 hours each, so the pattern shifts and no man draws the same midnight forever. The bell marks each half hour, 1, then 2, up to 8, the end of a watch, when the clapper rings out a fuller music and men trade places without hurry or waste. The rhythm is merciful. You learn to sleep in coils, 20 minutes on a locker with your hat over your eyes, an hour in a hammock as it rocks like a cradle, a stolen half dream with your back against warm planking and the sun on your face. Work starts when breakfast ends. The boatswain, sharp-eyed, with a voice that can cut through wind, leads the morning's tasks. Rigging is a living thing. It frays, stretches, chafes. Hands go aloft with palm and needle, marline and serving mallet. A splice is laid with calm precision, each tuck sitting like a small promise. Ratlines that have loosened are hitched. A chafe point gets a sleeve of baggy wrinkle, soft rope fringe that keeps a sail from soaring its own death against a stay. On deck, another gang hauls spare cable out for inspection and worms parcels and serves it. Tar in the nostrils, tar in the hair, tar in the fingerprints that never really wash away. The carpenter opens his chest and the ship seems to sigh in relief at the sight of well-oiled tools. He taps a plank that sounded odd last night, drives oakum into a seam with a caulking iron, and pays the line with a hot brush of pitch that gleams like obsidian. Cleanliness is not vanity, it is survival. Decks are scrubbed with sand and stone until they feel like bone under bare feet. If a holy stone, a soft block of sandstone, rides under calloused hands, so much the better. The scuppers run brown at first, then clear. Pumping the bilge is a daily liturgy. Men take turns at the brake or the chain pump, the wet clatter and suck of valves rising from below like a creature that must be kept fed. The quartermaster watches, counting strokes against the hourglass, satisfied only when the bilge water's reek softens and the sound grows easy. Weapons get their own hour. Muskets are swabbed, pistols cleaned, flints checked for a fresh, sharp edge. A good flint throws a shower you can trust. A dull one is a coward at the crucial moment. Cutlasses are wiped with oil. Boarding pikes are inspected for splinters that might tear a hand. Powder is moody stuff, kept dry in the magazine under strict rules. No open flame, no sparks, no rough boots. The gunner runs his eye along the vent of each carriage gun, checks sponges and rammers, and rehearses the crew until the steps — worm, sponge, load, ram, run out, prick and prime — happen as naturally as breathing. Navigation is a quieter craft threaded through the day. In the forenoon, someone brings up the log line. A wooden chip goes over the stern, the sand glass turns, and the count of knots on the line, spaced just so, tells the speed that goes into the logbook. Near noon, if the weather grants a clean sun, the master or skilled hand takes latitude. A backstaff lifts against the glare. Numbers are murmured. A dot goes on the worn chart where another day's work meets the world's geometry. The traverse board comes down at watch change. Little pegs move to show the courses steered and the speeds made for each half hour. Dead reckoning is an old conversation between ship and sea, and it rarely shouts. It mostly says steady now, a little more east. That current is sly. When the wind sleeps, men become the wind. Sweeps, long oars, go out through the gun ports. Backs bend and straighten in a rhythm set by a song. The hull slides forward with a soft, grateful sound, half a knot wrestled from stubborn water. A longboat may be lowered to tow the ship's nose toward a darker patch where a cat's paw is walking. Sometimes they kedge, row an anchor ahead, drop it, then heave on the capstan until the ship creeps up to it. A few score yards earned against a sullen tide. Work without wind is hot, salt running into eyes, but a man sleeps well after it. Food returns at midday and appetite comes with it. The cook, whose kingdom is a cramped caboose that swings and rattles, works small miracles with big spoons. Peas pottage thick enough to stand a spoon in, salt meat trimmed of the worst of its fat and boiled until it yields, if the quartermaster allows, a second ladle for the men who've been at the pumps. On lucky days, fish flicker into the pot, dolphin fish bright as coins, or a shark hauled aboard and carved into steaks. A lime squeezed over a pan can lift 30 men's spirits at once. The line at the water butt is watched. Fresh water goes stale in the cask. Men learn to drink past the taste with a shrug, or mask it with a splash of spirits. Rain is a blessing. Awnings turn into catchers, canvas bellies sagging into barrels as clean water drums in. You can bathe in rain if you laugh and move fast. Saltwater washing comes first on most days. A rinse in fresh is a rare luxury. Afternoons stretch long or vanish in an instant depending on what the horizon brings. On quiet days, clothing is mended, sailor's palm pushing the needle through stiff cloth, and shoes are patched with scraps of hide. A man might sit with his back to the mainmast and plait sennet, long straw-coloured braids of rope yarn that later strengthen seizings. Another might carve pipe bowls, small trinkets, a fid with a handle shaped like a whale or a bird. A cat stalks along the rail, well-fed and important. Rats are few where a good cat lives. The surgeon, if they are fortunate to have one, polishes instruments and checks his rolls of lint and thread. Those who can write scratch a line in a small book, words lurching with the ship's sway. Many cannot, but stories do the same work. Tales of ports that smell of spice and tar, of a woman who promised to wait or did not, of a captain's last ship and the prize that got away, always the prize that got away. A ship's temper changes when a sail specks the sky. Even at a mile, sailors read its life, the set of its canvas, the nervousness of its turn, the way it throws foam. Orders come crisp. Hands to braces. Stand by to where? Keep her full. If the captain chooses guile, a friendly flag may climb the halyards, nothing threatening in the run of the ship. If the crew prepares for a sudden pounce, pistols go into sashes, a net goes up over the waist to check borders, and the drummer or fifer feels his heart move faster. When the black flag finally breaks against the sky, it is not just a symbol, it is a labour-saving device. With luck and reputation, the other ship's courage fails, and surrender spares blood and preserves goods. Then the pirate day becomes paperwork and patience, a boarding party sorted and armed, hatches secured, a prize crew chosen, cargo tallied in a steady drone of numbers and items while the sun leans west. The quartermaster's chalk scratches columns on a board, coins counted, bales listed, barrels noted, and the first shares advance to men who need a new shirt or a good knife. But most days hold no chase, most days are craft. The sailmaker sets up under an awning with his bench and heavy needles, patching a rent that would tear wider in the next squall. The carpenter and his mate inspect the pumps, shave a sliver off a stubborn block, cut a new tree nail. The boatswain's mates tar the standing rigging, sticky, black and sweet-smelling, and encourage a new hand who has yet to accept that tar under the nails is a kind of marriage. A few men practice with pistols, firing at a cask tossed over the side. The splashes mark who needs more work and who is deadly. Another pair spars with cutlasses blunted, and a third man calls the match at first blood. The code is not fond of quarrels on deck. Practice is encouraged. Grudges are exported to the beach. Evenings come with a softness that makes hard lives feel briefly kind. The sun drops, decks are cleared, and the bell leads the day into a different kind of time. If there is a fiddler, he plays without needing to be asked. If there is only a voice, it sings and others join. Work songs that once kept hands moving at the capstan turn into slower airs that taste of home, of harbours that smelled of bread or fish, of lanes where children ran. Dice and cards may be forbidden by the articles, but men will always find ways to keep score. A game with knotted cords, a board scratched with charcoal for checkers using musket balls and corks. The quartermaster does his own quiet set of rounds, rations checked, the night's watch list read, a word here about a man's good work, a warning there about a slack line that nearly cost someone a finger. The first dog watch yields to the second. Lamps are hooded. Rules about flame are strict because wood forgets nothing of the fire you bring to it. Pipes glow briefly at the lee rail, smoke whipped away in threads. A last bucket of seawater sluices the galley deck. Hammocks are unrolled again, each in its space, and the deck becomes a forest of swinging bodies, the snore of a man with a broken nose mixing with the creak of timbers and the soft little random noises a ship makes. So many that when a truly new sound comes, everybody on watch hears it and knows to be wary. Night work requires a different touch. The helmsman steers by feel as much as sight. The compass card, the pull on the tiller, the slight weather helm that tells him the sails are drawing right. The lookout high in the foretop wraps his cloak and tries not to envy the warmth below. Eyes tuned to the horizon, where a light might be friend, foe, or a star playing tricks at the waterline. The leadsman keeps his steady, almost lullaby cadence. By the mark, by the deep, and a quarter. The master leans over the chart in the great cabin, listening to the ship the way a smith listens to a bell he has just cast. Stars move in their enormous wheel overhead. Men who know their shapes call them by old names. The Dipper, the Southern Cross when they're far south, Arcturus burning like a coal, Orion's belt climbing through the rigging, company, calendar, compass all at once. Weather writes its own chapters into the day. A squall line comes hard and fast, black underbellies rolling. The call goes up to reef, and men scatter to their stations, hands deft on wet canvas as the ship heels and recovers. A good crew can take a reef and laugh at the rain in the same minute. A true blow teaches humility. They may heave to, lying under short canvas with the ship's nose angled into the waves, or run off before it with bare poles and a drag astern to keep her head steady. There are no atheists in green water wrapped around a man's ribs, only sailors who listen hard to the ship and to one another. After, when the wind eases and the decks are washed pale, people move slower, kinder. A bottle passes, and even the captain's voice is a shade softer. Sundays when the sea permits feel different. Clothes are scrubbed and slung along lines, hammocks are beaten with sticks to lift the dust, and a quiet falls that is not quite silence. Someone reads a psalm or makes a prayer, someone else sits apart, hat in hands, and thinks of a church far inland with a wooden roof and habitable ghosts. Even the captain tries not to shout, but if a sail rises where none should be, the Sabbath vanishes like a gull in a squall, replaced by the necessary world of yards and guns. Illness threads itself through every routine. Teeth ache in a way that turns a man old. Fevers take hold and shake even strong bodies thin. The surgeon's table is small. His saw is swift because it must be. He will ask for citrus when he can get it, not because he says vitamin, but because every man knows how a fresh fruit puts spring back in a step dulled by salt beef. The articles promise coin for a lost arm or eye. Messmates promise soup, a blanket, and a hand to lift the cup. Death, when it comes, is a simple ritual. The sewn canvas shroud gets a last stitch through the nose to be sure. The board tips, the sea receives. Someone says words in whatever faith he carries. Then the bell rings and the ship and the day go on. Now and then, the day opens into a different shape, careening in a creek where mangroves breathe, the ship heeled over on tackles with her belly bared, men scraping barnacles and weed while others guard the tree line for patrols, or a visit to a quiet beach to cut wood and fill casks, hats turned into buckets, shoulders scarred by the yoke of water, or a week in a haven where the deck empties to taverns and markets, where coin runs like spilled grain, where laughter is loud and fights are resolved or postponed by force of company. Those days cannot last. Sailors always walk back up the gangplank, a little richer or a little poorer, and the ship takes them in like a mother taking back unruly children. On the smallest scale, a day is in the tools a man carries, a good knife sharpened on a stone until it feels like an extension of his will, a marlin spike smooth and black from use, a bit of beeswax for thread, a length of spare cord tucked like a secret. It is in the little customs, touching the mast for luck after a near miss, spitting over the side for a fair wind, refusing to whistle because someone swears it calls up a gale. It is in the jokes that never die, and the stories that become the ship's own folklore, passed to new hands with a wink and a warning not to improve them too much. When midnight drifts in and the sea turns to black glass or broken silver, the ship's world has drawn tight. The last pipes are stamped out. The bell finds 8 again. The boy turns the glass and stares for a moment into the long sand of his own future. The watch settles into its soft ballet, footsteps light, voices low, canvas murmuring its ancient language overhead. It is not all glory and not all hardship. It is a practice of keeping water out of wood, of keeping order in a place that hates order, of taking what the day offers and making it sufficient. Tomorrow will be much the same until it isn't. A prize might appear, a storm might walk in, a new hand might surprise everyone with a song from a country half the crew has never seen. But tonight, as the ship breathes and the sea answers, the day closes around the men like a well-cut sail, snug, serviceable, and full of quiet power. Hunting begins long before a gun is run out. It starts in the way a crew reads the sky and the water, in how they put the ship where a prize must pass rather than where it might. Lanes through the islands are like streets in a known town. The Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the Yucatan Channel, the long blue escalator of the Gulf Stream, the Mona Passage off Puerto Rico. A captain who knows the calendar of commerce knows that sugar runs heavy after harvest, that treasure fleets avoid hurricane season, that India men keep to set tracks the way migrating birds keep to invisible highways. So the ship waits where a trap looks like open sea. Canvas is reduced to a modest shape, a friendly flag idles from the peak, and the lookout, shaded by a rag of sail, becomes a needle searching for the faintest thread. A pale nick of cloth on the horizon, a topmast vanishing and appearing again in the long breath of the swell. Once a sail is raised, the game shrinks to decisions counted in heartbeats. Does the wind give the weather gauge, that sweet position to windward, from which you can choose to close or hold off? If the prey is sluggish, unhandy, or poorly trimmed, you fall in under false colours, quiet as a thought, letting your speed speak first. If she's well handled, you begin to shave away her options, drive her downwind where shoals and banks favour your shallow draught, or edge to leeward so that any attempt she makes to bear away bleeds speed and nerve. Rigging thrums, braces creak. The helmsman, eyes soft and far away, feels the ship lean into each tiny adjustment. There is no shouting when it goes well. Orders are the small words that move a world. Weather bracer spoke. Ease the main. Keep her full. Deception is labour-saving, and pirates are practical people. The custom of false colours is old. Show one flag until the moment of decision, then strip it away and show your truth before you fire. That last step is a courtesy in theory, a calculation in practice. The black banner that climbs when the time comes is not one picture, but a family of warnings. A skull and bones speaks plain. An hourglass says time is short. A red flag, all blood and no emblem, can whisper no quarter without a word. Some captains paint hearts that drip, skeletons that toast with a glass in one hand and stab with the other. Each design is a rumour with edges. The goal is to end a fight before it starts. Cargo breaks when men are desperate. Men die when captains are proud. If the prey bolts, the chase tightens. Bow chasers, long light guns on slides, are run forward and their crews go through the ritual of powder, wad, shot and quill. The first shots are not for glory, they are for legs and nerves. Chain shot or bar shot, two iron halves linked or a bar between them, will chew a sail and murder a yard so that even a brave captain has to admit that speed is slipping away. A raking shot across the stern, grape and langrage whipping down the long open deck, breaks steering and rattles the soul. In the tops, sharpshooters settle against the footocks, with muskets across their knees, waiting to pick off helmsmen and officers if the thing turns ugly. Smoke drifts with the wind. Powder stings the nose. The helmsman keeps her straining for that last half cable's length that turns a running fight into a grappling match. Boarding is choreography and thunder. Grapnels fly with a clang and bite into rail or shroud. A swivel gun spits a fistful of iron scrap down the enemy's deck at arm's length. Earthenware grenados, pots filled with powder and bits of metal, arc and burst in concussive pops that wring a man's teeth. A stink pot, fouler than its name, can shove men off a position they would otherwise die to hold. Then the close work begins, cutlass and pike, pistol fired once and then used as a club, boots sliding on a deck suddenly slick with water, spilled rum, and fear. The best boarding parties move like a poured liquid, 3 men to a knot, 1 strikes high, 1 low, 1 guards the flanks. The goal is never slaughter, it is to break shape. Once shape breaks, once a crew is pushed out of the line of courage into the corners of the deck, hands fly up, weapons clatter, and the human part of the work replaces the iron part. Speed matters after surrender as much as before. Hatches are clapped shut and guarded from below to pen the defeated crew without humiliation. Pistols and knives are collected and bundled out of reach. The quartermaster steps aboard with chalk and ledger while the captain sees to the ship. A prize crew, trustworthy, sober for the hour and handpicked, takes command of the captured helm and sails. If the prize is stout and useful, she may be kept and traded for the old ship when the next creek offers privacy. If she's merely fat with goods, she is lightened of exactly what men need most: coin, medicines, fresh stores, good canvas, sound cordage, and anything that makes a life afloat less mean. Nothing snarls the day like a loose man with a knife. The quartermaster's calm is a kind of weapon here too. He writes, he counts, he assigns guards and courtesies, and the crew breathes easier because order has replaced the storm. Reputation shadows every part of the hunt. A captain known for keeping his word when a ship yields early can show the black flag and win a cargo with barely a scratch. A captain who delights in cruelty finds that his victories are all costly ones. Merchants run until their sails are ribbons, men fight in corners until steel climbs the rigging, cargo is kicked to splinters by panic. Even pirates who are not sentimental count costs. The rumour of a fair hand spread in taverns and galleys from Barbados to the Carolinas is as valuable as another pair of 6-pounders. Word travels faster than ships, so does a lie, and a wise quartermaster will correct one loudly in the next port if it eats into his business. Weather is an ally and an enemy during the hunt. A squall can hide an approach or blind a lookout. Rain turns decks into skating floors at the exact moment when grace and a sure foot decide who lives. Banks and reefs become weapons for a shallow-drafted sloop that dares a channel a deep-keeled merchantman would never attempt. At night, a ship can vanish by snuffing every light and turning her black side to the sky, while the prize, lit by her own carelessness, becomes a moving lantern. Stars draw the lines, but it is hands that follow them. Top men moving like cats in a sky of cordage. A helmsman who knows when to trust the little tug that says a jib wants an inch. A gunner who hears in the hollow of a barrel whether a charge sits wrong. There is art in good theft. The tools of fear are stagecraft as much as iron. Slow matches braided into hair or beard so that sparks dance in the dark. Drums rattle just before the grapples bite. A roar of voices timed to the first grenade bursting on a forecastle. The sudden starkness of a red flag hoisted when a defender hesitates. But none of these tricks last without structure beneath them. The articles that bind the crew also bind their rage. They do not waste men on heroics that prove nothing. They do not spill blood that cheaper fear could save. They are not paladins, and they are not butchers. They are workers with dangerous tools and a schedule to keep. When the smoke thins and the prize's sails fill under new hands, a second life begins. The one counted in chalk and coin, in casks and bales and barrels, in the sound of silver on a table. Loot is not a dragon's hoard slid into a cavern. It is a stream that feeds 100 small needs and a few large ones. The quartermaster oversees the first division. Medicines and instruments to the surgeon because fevers and splinters don't wait. Cordage, canvas and blocks to the boatswain and sailmaker because wind is the ship's only engine. Tar, pitch, tallow, oakum, and spares to the carpenter because the sea prees at every seam. Powder and ball to the gunner because reputation rests partly on being able to back a threat with iron if talk fails. Personal advances come next by rule or custom. Shirts and shoes to the man with rags, a new pistol to the one who proved he'd make it sing, tobacco and soap because dignity is a tool too. These are not gifts. They are accounted line by line against the taker's share. Coin, when it comes, makes everything easier. Spanish silver dollars, pieces of 8, are familiar, heavy, and trustworthy. They can be weighed when they are crude cobs, clipped when you need change, stacked when they are milled and neat. They spend in every port that knows a ship's wake from a river's ripple. Men who swear they hate figures learn to love the tidy comfort of 8 reals breaking into halves and quarters, bits that jingle into a tavern keeper's hand and buy a night that smells of clean sheets and cooked meat. But pirates are equal opportunity receivers. Gold doubloons tucked in a bosun's bag, Dutch and French coin, English guineas, little local tokens that only a particular islander will take. Silver is best because everyone loves the moon when it is solid. Goods are money that need midwives. Sugar must be rebarreled when its marks would hang the cellar. Indigo cakes move under new papers. Cocoa, coffee and tobacco slide through hands that treat them like a church treats relics, handled, kissed, and never loudly named. Fine cloth becomes clothing found in a slop chest. Tools become old stock from a chandler's back room. Medicine becomes a miracle that arrived just in time. A certain logic governs the flow. Friendly merchants, friendly because the quartermaster pays in full and at once, take on the risk of turning stolen cargo into export that looks innocent. The tavern is the exchange where this talk begins. The back of the chandlery is where it settles. A cooper earns twice when he scrubs marks from staves and sets new ones. A clerk who can ink plausible bills of lading glances once at the door and writes quickly, because his own reputation is worth coin to him, and rope if he's careless. The shadow economy is not a cloud of nameless villains. It has faces and trades. A sloop owner who never asks about the last harbour a cargo saw. A washerwoman who hides a little roll of hard money in the seam of a shirt. A carpenter who accepts a keg of pitch and returns the favour by working midnight hours during careen. A woman who runs a lodging house where the prices are fair only if she trusts the quartermaster's notebook. A magistrate who takes his bribe so politely that he can believe it was a gift. Some men look away for a share, some look away for peace, some look away because, in a world where wages come late and food is dear, this flow is as regular as tide and easier to live with than the laws pretend. Shares make or break the faith that keeps the whole machine going. The articles speak in fractions, clean and cool. 2 shares to the captain, 1.5 to the quartermaster, 1.25 to the specialists. The gunner with his touch of alchemy, the boatswain who knows every rope by feel, the carpenter who can keep water out of wood, the sailmaker whose seams are worth more than a prayer. 1 share to every able hand. Boys and landsmen take smaller portions until they prove they can climb in a squall and keep their nerve at a hot muzzle. The first man to sight a sail may earn a bonus. The first man over the rail in a boarding may claim a small prize. Pistols, a fine coat, a watch, nothing that sours the crew, everything that oils its joints. Injury has its ledger too. A man who loses a right arm earns more than one who loses a left. A grim arithmetic that calculates how work gets done on deck. A leg is dear, and an eye is not cheap. No one pretends these valuations are just in the grand way. They are simply close enough to keep men from fearing that one bad moment will leave their mates hungry. The ship is a small town with dangerous streets. The town keeps its poorhouse funded because everyone may need it tomorrow. Periodic settlement is a relief and a hazard. Relief, because men like to see silver in their hand rather than promises on a page. Hazard, because a port can drink money faster than a hole can drink pitch. The quartermaster is part treasurer, part uncle, part schoolmaster at these moments. He pays out, he notes debt settled, he advances a careful amount for clothing and tools, and he frowns at the man who asks for his whole share in coin when the ship still needs cordage, nails, and tar. He cannot forbid a spree. He can suggest that a pair of shoes, a new knife, and a small pouch of dollars make more sense than a single heavy clink that turns into fog and songs in a night. Prices in havens that wink at pirates are 2 prices, the one for strangers, and the one for friends. A crew that pays its bills becomes everyone's friend. A crew that breaks a table or refuses a tally sees numbers fatten and courtesies thin. This is a world of reputations braided tight. A captain, known to keep his men out of brawls, finds that carpenters finish his mast first. A quartermaster who settles at once finds that tar arrives before anyone else's. The law might write edicts. The dockside writes its own small commandments, and they are enforced by purse and by shoulder. Not all wealth waits for a port to realise itself. Slush, the fat skimmed from boiled meat, can be saved and sold to a chandler for candles and soap. Bones become handles and dice. Canvas scraps become bags and ditty kits that fetch a bit with men coming off another ship. Even waste has gravity in an economy where everything is dear. The cook knows who will buy trimmings. The carpenter knows who will pay for offcuts of rare wood. The boatswain knows a boy who will trade a bit of tobacco for a length of decent line. These are thin streams, but they feed the same river. Morals, such as they are, have their own markets. Some crews free enslaved people from prizes and enroll them as equal hands with equal shares, their labour and knowledge immediately valued. Some crews, uglier and no less real, sell captured people where the price is good and the governor looks away. Articles can incline a ship toward mercy, but they cannot altogether save her from the age she sails through. What the code can do is make the debate public. If a decision offends enough men's consciences, a captain feels it in his chair at the next election. When a cruise ends, the economy of plunder throws one last shadow forward. A man with money in his belt and a promise to himself goes ashore to buy a watch, a knife, a pair of boots, a ring for someone who waited, or simply 3 days of sleep in linen. Some keep a little coin rolled deep in their clothes against the next hard run of luck. Some gamble it into songs and forgetfulness. Enough of them wander back up the gangplank when the ship cocks her head toward the inlet that the machine can start again. Orders, watches, the neat music of the bell, the softing of tar under a warm sun, and somewhere out there a sail that does not yet know it will be a ledger entry by nightfall. If the hunt is the work's sharp edge, the money is its handle. The two fit together by design. Fear, well-managed, economical, saves powder, masts, and lives. Order, well-kept accounts, clear shares, saves friendships, time, and the patience of those on shore who make a living turning hot loot into cold coin. In that fit is the thing that made a small ship with a black flag a match for a world supposedly ruled by empires. The ability to move quickly from intention to action to settlement, and then, without ceremony, to do it again. A pirate harbour announces itself long before the pier. The sound of surf muffled by mangroves, a scurf of tar on the air, gulls quarrelling over fish guts, the clack of blocks from dozens of masts packed against a green shore. The first thing the ship wants is a place to breathe, and havens in the islands give it that. The deep cups of Nassau and Port Royal, the wrinkled inlets of Tortuga, the turtle-backed cays of the Bahamas where a shallow draught sloop can slide into water no frigate dares. Sail comes down in a hush, the anchor goes with a throat-clearing roar, and then a different rhythm takes over. Boats plying to and from the beach, men shouting in 3 languages at once, barrels rolling like drums along planks laid over wet sand. Some ports are old cities that decided not to ask questions. Port Royal, before the earth shook in 1692 and folded whole streets into the sea, was one of the richest square miles on the planet. There a man could find anything. A goldsmith who would rework a Spanish doubloon into a ring with a secret compartment. A tailor who could turn a bolt of stolen velvet into a waistcoat bright enough to make a bishop blush. Taverns with names that promised exactly the level of trouble they delivered. After the quake, the habit of business shifted as habits do to other corners, Kingston across the bay, then further north and east, as governors grew fussy and warships less lazy. On Tortuga, the island that looks like a turtle crouched off Hispaniola, the life was more makeshift and therefore more forgiving. Ramshackle wharves, French and English and Spanish all muddled together, barrels of salt stacked like fortifications, and breezeways where a man could drink rum so coarse it seemed to bite back. The buccaneers who tanned hides and smoked meat in the early years left their crafts behind even as they took to proper ships. The word for their slow cooking, boucan, lingered, and so did their taste for independence. A sloop could come in under a thin excuse, sell a cargo of dyewood and indigo salvaged from a wreck that everyone knew had been helped into distress, then trade rumours as carefully as coin. Which convoys have escorts? Which governor has grown more severe? Which coral beach has a clean slope for careening and a spring in the trees? Nassau becomes, for a little while in the 1710s, a rumour made real, a place where the governor is either absent or complicit, where the reefs at the harbour mouth are a second set of gates, where a marketplace sprouts from sand and willpower. The anchorage at New Providence holds 100 small ships when talk is thick, their hulls bumping like cattle in a pen, their crews swapping men the way children swap marbles. It is a camp more than a city, palm frond roofs, ovens dug into the ground, palisades knocked together from driftwood and ambition. Yet even in this ragged republic, order blooms, a signal code for strangers approaching the bar, a roll of names that can be produced when a captain vanishes and leaves debts, an understanding that a man who steals from the common pile ashore will find himself just as surely punished as if he had picked a shipmate's chest at sea. Careening beaches are the hidden cathedrals of these places. The ship is walked up under the trees with anchors and tackles laid out like a spider's web. She's heaved down on her side until her belly shows pale and begrimed. Tools and materials jump ashore, scrapers, caulking irons, tar bubbling in iron pots, oakum teased apart by patient fingers. One gang scrapes barnacles until they flake away like thin china. Another beats oakum into seams. Another pays the planks with a hot brush, the pitch shining black in the sun before it dulls to armour. Watch posts go up along the beach and in the scrub, because a careening ship is a helpless ship, and boys are set to shout if a masthead appears where no masthead should. Between tides, men wash clothes in freshwater rivulets and set them on lines, check their pistols, mend hammocks, and trade stories with other crews doing the same work 2 coves over, a slow, holy labour, making the hull young again. Shoreside trade has its own tides. The quartermaster brings the ledger that counts as a passport in these communities, and shopkeepers' faces change when they see it. A chandler with a careful soul sells powder, ball, and coils of line out the front and takes a quiet keg of slush, galley fat, out the back to render into candles and soap. A cooper earns in both directions, scrubbing off the murderously informative marks of a sugar barrel, and then plying on a fresh brand to suit some invented consignee. The tavern keeper turns into a banker by habit. She extends credit to a crew with a name for settling, refuses a second drink to a man who looks likely to pull a knife, and overcharges only the ones who brag about how they cannot be cheated. Neutrality is a fiction everyone tells until it stops being useful. Politics blow through a haven like squalls. One year a tolerating governor looks the other way. The next, a man like Woodes Rogers arrives in the Bahamas with the king's pardon in one hand and orders for a clean sweep in the other, and the sand seems to change beneath your boots. Some captains accept the pardon, test its teeth, and take service against former friends. Others burn their bridges and their reputation at the same moment and make a last hard season of it in the far flats and shoals, where a king's will takes time to arrive. Even then, the harbour remains a living organism that remembers who paid, who stole, who kept his word. Sloops of war ride in the roadstead where pirate sloops once anchored. Forts that used to be mostly for show acquire fresh cannon and fresh garrisons. The same breeze that dries washed shirts along a rail brings a new rulebook, and men either bend or leave. Far from the Caribbean, another world answers to the same needs. Along Madagascar's northeastern edge, in the lee of islands like Sainte Marie, ships that have hunted Red Sea convoys and Indian traders gather in quiet bays. The monsoon writes the calendar here. The air smells different. The coin is different too. Crews that have seen Mocha, Surat and the coral-ringed harbours of the Swahili coast know a different set of fences and friends. Banyan merchants who can make money walk in several directions at once, Arab pilots who read currents by the colour of the water, Malagasy leaders who trade labour, food and daughters-in-law for muskets and cloth. Tales drift around cook fires about a pure brotherhood called Libertalia, a place where no flag flies but the one that forbids masters and slaves. Perhaps it is only talk. What is not talk is the way an outpost grows wherever money, skill and a scorn for bother meet an anchorage and a spring. Port life rubs the sea's hard corners down. A dockside courtship might last a night or a month. A friendship begun over a card table turns into a partnership that moves bales from one storeroom to another when the moon is down. A fight that would have brought iron at sea dissolves under the glare of a woman who keeps both your coins in her till. Children play at boarding with sticks and barrels. A cat stalks along a railing with the calm of a professional. A black fiddler earns 3 crews' attention at once with a tune that knows exactly how much homesickness the room can bear. You could believe in such moments that the Republic is real and will last forever. You would be wrong, but believing it makes a hard life turn soft for an hour. The body keeps its own accounts in this world, and they are paid in a different currency: fever, pain, strength, sleep. The ocean is cleaner than cities, but it conspires with heat, wet and work to wear men out. Teeth go first for many: salt meat and biscuit, sugar when the loot has been lucky, grit in everything. The mouth becomes a battlefield. A toothache can unmakes a strong man. A ship surgeon, if the ship has one, keeps a selection of pincers, pelicans and crude forceps oiled and ready, and the chair is steady because it must be. A quick pull, a swab of spirits, a lump of cloth to bite, and a night of throbbing that feels like fire under bone. It is primitive, and yet it saves a life more often than romance guesses. A bad tooth can kill faster than a bullet if left to rot. Scurvy is a sly thief. It does not come like a storm. It comes like a shadow, sitting in the gums and behind the knees, whispering fatigue, bruises that bloom from nothing, wounds that refuse to close. The cure is simple in hindsight and uneven in practice. Fresh greens, fruit, a turn of limes or oranges or a mess of wild sorrel gathered from the shore. No one speaks of vitamin C. They speak of what experience taught, that crews who ate turtle meat and sipped lime water fared better, that a prize with a store of citrus was a blessing larger than its glittering coin. In northern waters, spruce beer and a handful of tender shoots boiled into a bitterness seemed to help. Cures do not always arrive in time. Scurvy leaves its signature. Old scars open, teeth loosen, spirits droop. The quartermaster remembers such details when he argues for a day ashore at a green island instead of another long reach on half rations. Fevers are another matter. Malaria and yellow jack hang in certain harbours like invisible flags. The surgeon keeps Peruvian bark, quinine, in his chest if he can get it. Its bitterness promises a fighting chance. Laudanum, opium dissolved in spirits, sits beside it, a blessing and a danger, painkiller, cough quiet, and sedative that can nurse a man through a bad night or steal his sense by imperceptible degrees. Calomel and antimony powders come out when the surgeon believes in purging. Sometimes they help, sometimes they only make a man weaker. Cleanliness is both faith and practice. Hammocks aired every fair day. Bedding beaten, bilges pumped until the stink softens, galley decks scrubbed after every boiling. Rats are kept in check by cats and traps. Fresh air is not a luxury, it is part of the prescription. Then there are the sudden catastrophes, the splinter that drives deep into a thigh during a broadside, the crushed hand under a runaway sheet, the musket ball that mashes bone at pistol shot distance in the smoke of a boarding. The surgeon's theatre is a table that can be scrubbed, a bucket for spent water and worse, a set of knives wetted and kept away from rust, a saw whose teeth bite clean. Tourniquets are twisted until the colour drains. A draught of spirits is poured and held to a trembling mouth, and then the work happens fast because speed is mercy. Hot pitch or a cautery iron kisses a stump to slow the bleeding. The patient's friends hold him against the table's urge to buck. It is not beautiful, but it is competent, and competence at sea is a kind of love. Compensation for wounds, set out in the articles, translates pity into practice. A man who loses a leg does not have to beg. The common stock is his. He may still do useful work, keep the sandglass, tend the surgeon's instruments, teach younger hands the smart way to reeve a block or splice an eye. Pride adjusts with help. A crew that honours its bargain for the maimed becomes braver in the next fight, because risk feels less like a cliff and more like a steep path with rails. Belief is everywhere, because chance is everywhere. Superstition runs through the deck like a second set of rigging. Whistling might call a gale, turning a loaf upside down might insult the spirits, killing an albatross is unthinkable, a cat's washing behind the ear portends rain. Some men touch the mainmast for luck at the change of the watch. Some carry bits of bone or coin as charms, rubbed smooth between finger and thumb until they shine. A Bible may be read of a Sunday when the sea allows, a psalm delivered in a voice both rough and sincere. A rosary might hide in a pocket where an eye won't find it in the wrong crowd. When the wind dies at noon, someone tells the story of the ghost fire that dances on mastheads in certain storms, St. Elmo's light, and argues whether it is a blessing or a warning. The argument settles nothing. The telling settles the heart. Medicine lives on shore too, in the hands of midwives and healers who know local plants better than any ship's chest. Poultices of aloe and chewed leaves for burns, decoctions of bark for fevers, smoke to calm a cough, green herbs to put back iron and strength. A crew that respects these people survives longer. In some places, disease asks for a tax in barter, a cask of rum for a basket of limes, a length of good cloth for a bundle of roots. In other places, the tax is more subtle, time spent recovering when the ship aches to sail, a season lost to a fever that never quite leaves the bones. Sleep is medicine as well, and rare. Men learn to make the most of narrow rests, a hammock that rocks away pain, a spot on deck where the sun warms knots out of shoulders, the trick of closing the eyes while hands keep working at some task the body knows without the mind. Music anaesthetizes too. A fiddle, a pipe, a human voice in a slow air can ease a fevered dream's edges, the way a steady hand on a brow calms a child. Stories do the rest. Old folk tales, new lies about prizes taken and governors fooled, memories of fields and streets ashore. Laughter lights the dark on purpose. A good joke is a charm that repels despair. Death has rules because grief needs them. The canvas shroud is sewn with care, last stitch through the nose to make certain the sleep is the right kind. If there's time, a coin goes with the dead, not because anyone expects a ferryman in salt water, but because old customs hold the heart steady. Words are said by the man willing to say them. The prayer is less important than the pause that holds the ship still for a minute. The board tilts, the sea takes back what it always meant to keep. The living turn to their work again because that too is a ritual. In the ledger, a line goes against the name, and the quartermaster notes to whom the dead man's share should go. The woman he named, the child someone remembers, the friend who sat by him in fever and lifted the cup to his lips. Out of all this, the ports that function like markets and neighbourhoods, the health that is managed like a set of delicate sails, comes a truth that is less romantic than reliable. Freedom, the kind chased under a black flag, is not only a mood. It is a system made of beaches that welcome, shops that trade quietly, doctors who work with what they have, cooks who know how to stretch a barrel a week further, and 100 small promises kept between men whose lives depend on one another. Empires write their laws in London and Madrid. Pirates write theirs on planks and in ledgers under palm thatch. The writing is not pretty. It is legible. It keeps a ship from turning into an accident and a crew from turning into a mob. and when the wind rises and the anchor comes to the cathead, it lets the ship go back to sea with its people provisioned, repaired, mended in body and mind just enough to face the blue again. Legends thrived because the sea is a poor archivist and a great storyteller. Smoke, salt and rumour made reputations larger than the men who carried them. Yet if you stood close to those lives, you would find details plain as rope. The man called Blackbeard, Edward Teach or Thatch depending on who spelled it, braided slow-burning match into his beard so that in the press of battle, a crown of sparks hissed around his face. It was theatre, and it worked. He liked intimidation better than bloodshed because broken cargo and dead hands were bad for business, and terror is cheaper than powder. He blockaded Charleston once to bargain for medicine, not jewels, and let his prisoners go when he had what he wanted. In the end he died not as a myth but as a sailor in a close fight, on a shoal in the Sounds of North Carolina, cut down by men under a young lieutenant who had the patience to lure him in. His head hung from a bowsprit for the journey home, a warning made into a figurehead, and then on a riverside for months, where tide and gulls did their slow work while men on the quay pretended not to glance up. Another figure moves quickly through the years like a long, clean wake. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, dressed in finery and discipline. If Blackbeard played at Storm, Roberts was a steady trade wind, relentless, efficient, careful of his crew's rules and his ship's trim. He took more prizes than any of his famous peers, not through rage but through method. A fast hull, a crew drilled to the minute, and a knack for appearing where the merchant lanes knotted. He enforced quiet on Sundays when weather permitted, kept his officers in their place, and punished theft from shipmates with an iron certainty that made the deck feel safe, even as the horizon bristled with opportunities. He died on a February day off Cape Lopez, a grape shot tearing him from the quarterdeck, and with him something calm went out of the age. His men said he fell facing forward. Some names look like melodrama written in ink that won't wash out. Charles Vane, brave and ungovernable, burned bridges with the same enthusiasm he brought to burning prizes, and ended, after a turn at wrecking and a last attempt to claw himself back to sea, on a Jamaican gallows. Edward Lowe, whose temper ran hotter than most men's powder, left behind stories of cruelty that even taverns told in quiet voices. He reminds you that pirates were not Robin Hoods with better hats, but workers with weapons in an age that paid for skill and punished weakness with indifference. Steder Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, came to sea from a plantation rather than a forecastle, bought a sloop instead of stealing it, and learned too late that knowledge of crops and accounts makes a poor substitute for the sensory grammar of wind and current. His brief partnership with Blackbeard reads like a short play about charisma and naivete. His death in Charleston reads like a long footnote about how the shore always has the last word. Women arrive in the tale like sparks in a dark hold because the world did not expect them at all. Anne Bonny and Mary Read cut their hair, wore men's clothes, cursed and fought, and when they were taken at last with Calico, Jack Rackham's crew, they pled their bellies, claimed pregnancy, and so stepped aside from the rope for a while. Mary died in prison. Anne vanishes into rumour and silence, which is how the sea likes to end a story when a neat ending is not at hand. Their lives are not proof of a golden equality aboard every black-flagged ship. They are proof that in a floating world that valued nerve, speed and loyalty, a person who could carry their share of danger might find a place that would be unthinkable ashore. A century turns on a single day when Henry Avery, every in some papers, takes a Muggle treasure ship in the Indian Ocean. The deed itself is simple by sea standards. A fast hunter, a slower, richer victim, a few minutes of concentrated violence. The consequences reach much further than his wake. Emperors offended, factories closed, men in wigs penning laws because one captain's choice upset the balance of trade on a continent. Posters go up from London to Boston offering rewards. A global manhunt begins before the term has been coined. You can feel, in the panic of that moment, how piracy had outgrown the tolerances that once sheltered it. Letters of marque had blurred lines for decades. Governors winked when it hurt their rivals more than themselves. After Avery, winks tightened into squints, and then into stares. The law learns to move faster. Vice-Admiralty courts spread along coasts like new lighthouses. Light turned back toward the water in a different way. Trials come without sympathetic juries of local merchants who secretly want their shipping insurance to stay cheap. Sentences are fierce and quick. The Latin phrase, hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind, steps from dusty books to the mouths of judges who have never reefed a sail, and yet suddenly understand that the sea is a road, not a frontier, and that those who rob on it shake the same coffers that pay for their own rooms and dinners. Gibbets go up at harbour mouths. Bodies hang in chains and weather to the colour of driftwood. Every captain entering port reads the warning twice, once with the eye, once with the gut. Kings offer pardons as if they were throwing nets. In 1717, and again the next year, notices go out. Come in, confess, take a royal forgiveness and return to honest work. It is a clever wedge driven into friendships. Some crews waver and split. Men with wives ashore who save coins in the hems of their dresses. Men with a lingering cough who wonder how many more cold dawns their joints can bear. Men tired of decisions that might tomorrow put them in irons. Others refuse on principle, or out of restlessness disguised as principle. The pardons are not purely mercy, they are tools. A governor in the Bahamas named Woodes Rogers arrives with both a paper generosity and a set of crisp orders, and suddenly Nassau feels less like a republic and more like a customs house. Hornigold, who once hunted under the same wind as the men he now chases, takes the king's grace and becomes a privateer again, and the circle closes. The navies change shape to meet the problem. No longer only lumbering ships of the line, now fast sloops of war and nimble cutters, built to claw through banks and shoals, to sit outside channels pirates once skimmed with impunity. Convoys become more regular. Armed escorts fly flags that mean business instead of theatre. Merchant captains hire a few more hands, train them to muskets, and accept the cost of dead weight for the comfort of a stiffer spine in the moment of decision. Insurance markets raise premiums until owners who once shrugged at the occasional loss begin to write to governors with a new urgency. The net is not one line, it is many, legal, naval, financial, drawn together until men who once slipped between them find snags at every turn. Endings rarely arrive all at once. One by one the famous lights go out. Blackbeard falls in a thicket of smoke and cutlass work in November of 1718. Bonnet swings the next month. Vane hangs a few years later, fierce to the end. Roberts dies in 1722 after a career that looked, for a startling stretch, like a new normal. Those who survive sell their knowledge. The best pilots take wages from the ships that used to be their prey. Carpenters go back to yards with stories and slightly better pay. Quartermasters discover that a tidy ledger can bring a peaceful life if you can bear the boredom. A few vanish inland, small farms, new names, a ring on a finger from a distant port, and carry to their graves the rarest treasure of all, which is the truth of what their days were like. The myths that remain are not accidents. In 1724, a book appears under the name Captain Charles Johnson, perhaps a pen name, perhaps another mask, that gathers lives into neat chapters. Avery's long echo, Roberts' relentless speed, the rope's cold logic. The book pretends to be a set of biographies. It is also a stage on which certain traits are dressed and lit for an audience hungry for the taste of danger, without the smell of bilge. Its pages fix faces that the sea would otherwise have blurred, and it sands away how often the work of piracy looked like any other craft. Maintenance, patience, a well-kept tool chest, and men who are tiresome or kind by turns. Later, centuries later, novels add bright parrots and maps with X's, and plays teach children to say, "pieces of 8" like a charm. The buried treasure that fills these pages belongs mostly to hunters of stories. Real hoards do not age well. Coin sweats through soil. Secrets leak from drunk mouths. Governments learn to sniff out sudden prosperity in the wrong places. Most pirates spent fast and died with little, a fact less romantic than a chest under a palm but truer to the rhythm of their lives. Some truths cut through the fog clean as a keel through light swell. Pirates were not an invention of costume but a surge at a particular historical moment. Experienced mariners pushed out of legal violence by peace, drawn into illegal violence by profit and a sense of self that felt larger under a code of their own making. They created briefly working democracies afloat in a time that rarely asked common men their opinion about anything. They mixed languages, colours, crafts and faiths in crews that confused authorities ashore who preferred neat lists and stable categories. They harmed people, they freed others, they upset ledgers and frightened kings. They laughed, sang, and argued about tiny practicalities, how to stow powder, how to split shares, how many candles could be burned after the second dog watch, because the big questions had already been answered by tidal forces beyond their control. The fall of the age does not mean the end of piracy, it means it migrates. The Mediterranean still has its corsairs. The South China Sea will one day have fleets of junks under leaders whose names the West pronounces poorly. Wherever trade braids into predictable routes and law is weak, the idea sleeps like a cat and wakes when the door opens. But the particular flavour of the Atlantic and Caribbean in the early 1700s, sloops running the Bahama banks, rumbling courts in Kingston and Charleston, pardons nailed to tavern doors, black flags as arguments rather than decorations, fades. What remains is a silhouette, a small, quick ship hard on the breeze, a crew that knows its business, a captain whose authority lasts exactly as long as the crew's patience, and a coast dotted with places that once agreed, quietly, to convert stolen motion into lawful rest. Walk along an old harbour at dusk and you can still find the faint architecture of that time. A ring set low in a stone wall where a boat once made fast, an alley that kinks because a warehouse wanted the last inch of a view to see who was coming in, a place name like Gallows Point that map makers keep because landmarks, like warnings, outlast fashion, a tavern sign that shows a skull out of habit more than menace. If you listen, really listen, you may hear the bell marking the end of a watch that no longer exists, and imagine men rolling their hammocks and handing the deck to friends. Their era was brief because empires finally focused. It is memorable because for a moment, men made a world that obeyed the rules they wrote in their own blunt hands, and then sailed it hard until the wind changed.